The outer reefs exist in perpetual twilight, where sunlight struggles to penetrate depths that serve as oceanic wilderness beyond formal territorial boundaries, creating sanctuary for creatures whose survival depends on avoiding attention from powerful forces that govern underwater civilization through authority that extends only as far as convenient enforcement permits. Here, where coral formations grow wild without architectural intervention, and currents carry nutrients that sustain life through natural abundance rather than cultivated gardens, Mermaid tends solitary existence that encompasses both exile and freedom from expectations that court life impose through obligations serving political necessity rather than individual welfare. The dwelling she has carved into living reef operates according to principles that honor oceanic ecosystem, while providing shelter adequate for basic survival without luxury, that her former status once provided, through privileges that demanded conformity to social expectations she ultimately rejected, despite consequences that banishment created. Small chambers accommodate sleeping, storage, and preparation of food that reef gathering provides through knowledge gained during childhood education that emphasized practical skills, alongside diplomatic protocol designed to prepare noble daughters for marriages serving kingdom advantage rather than personal happiness. The creatures that seek her assistance encompass species that formal veterinary care ignores, injured fish whose commercial value makes treatment uneconomical, diseased coral polyps whose restoration serves environmental benefit over immediate profit, sick marine plants whose welfare affects ecosystem balance despite individual insignificance within broader oceanic economy that prioritizes resource, extraction over environmental stewardship that sustains long-term abundance through careful preservation of natural cycles. Her reputation among reef inhabitants operates through whispered communication that travels through water with precision that terrestrial creatures cannot match, creating network of information that acknowledges her capability while maintaining protective secrecy about location and activities, that discovery by kingdom authority could transform into legal complications, extending beyond individual welfare to encompass broader questions about unauthorized medical practice and territorial jurisdiction, that exile technically eliminates despite practical knowledge that skill transcends political boundaries. Before we begin, remember to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Every day, a new story awaits you. Now, let us begin. The morning that changes everything begins with disturbance in current patterns that Mermaid recognizes as distress rather than natural oceanic movement, creating awareness that approaches through environmental sensitivity that solitary existence has heightened beyond normal mermaid perception, through necessity for detecting threats or opportunities that isolation makes essential for survival in. Territory where formal protection operates through community rather than individual resources. The creature that emerges from deeper waters carries exhaustion and movements that speak of extended travel, requiring determination that overcomes physical limitations through desperation that makes dangerous journey necessary, despite vulnerabilities that pregnancy creates for beings whose survival depends on avoiding attention from predators that view expectant males as easy prey due to mobility. Restrictions that advanced gestation imposes. "Please," the seahorse whispers, with voice that carries harmonics indicating noble bloodline despite obvious distress that formal court appearance would never permit, creating contradiction between inherited status and current circumstances that suggest crisis, extending beyond simple medical emergency to encompass political implications whose scope requires immediate assessment alongside clinicae. Intervention. "Help my children," he continues with plea that encompasses both parental instinct and recognition that specialized knowledge provides only hope for preserving life that conventional medical resources either cannot or will not address through assistance that exile prevents from accessing, despite emergency circumstances that transcend political considerations. The examination that follows reveals complications extending beyond normal birthing difficulties to encompass deliberate intervention, whose evidence suggests sabotage rather than natural developmental problems, creating recognition that pregnancy encompasses political weapon rather than simple biological process, whose success or failure affects not just individual family, but broader questions about succession and territorial authority. Poisoning. Mermaid diagnoses with clinical precision that encompasses both medical assessment and political understanding about methods that enemies employ to eliminate threats through biological warfare that operates beneath official detection while achieving strategic objectives that direct assassination might accomplish with greater risk of discovery and retaliation. Specific toxin that prevents normal birth process while maintaining fetal viability temporarily, creating situation where intervention becomes necessary to preserve life that natural delivery cannot accomplish, she continues, with explanation that encompasses both immediate medical crisis and longer-term implications whose resolution affects not just individual survival, but political consequence. That extend beyond family welfare. Royal poison, the Seahorse confirms with recognition that encompasses both personal knowledge about court politics and desperate hope that exile has not eliminated expertise necessary to counteract sabotage, whose sophistication suggests official, rather than casual source for biological warfare that requires advanced chemical knowledge alongside political access to target selection. Used against Prince Narion's pregnancy to prevent birth that would establish succession security, he explains with political context that transforms medical emergency into constitutional crisis, whose resolution affects not just individual family, but broader kingdom stability through consequences that eliminate or preserve heir, whose legitimacy serves territorial sovereignty against challenges from rival claimants. The revelation that pregnancy encompasses royal succession creates understanding that assistance encompasses not just humanitarian obligation, but political intervention, whose consequences affect both personal safety and broader kingdom welfare, through medical treatment that could reshape power structure, depending on outcome, that preserves or eliminates heir, whose birth determines legitimate authority. Countertoxin requires rare ingredients whose collection encompasses significant risk despite necessity for immediate treatment. Maribel explains with assessment that encompasses both medical possibility and practical challenges, whose resolution demands resources that exile has eliminated through banishment from court connections that previously provided access to specialized materials. Deep reef sources that formal gathering expeditions avoid due to territorial disputes with creatures whose cooperation requires negotiation rather than simple collection. She continues with explanation that encompasses both environmental knowledge and diplomatic necessity for obtaining assistance from beings whose help operates through respect, rather than authority that exile eliminates. I know these territories, the Seahorse offers, with recognition that cooperation provides foundation for successful treatment, while acknowledging mutual dependence that circumstances create, despite political barriers that normally prevent collaboration between exiled individuals and royal family members whose association violates protocols designed to maintain separation. Such cooperation requires secrecy that protects both participants from discovery that would create complications extending beyond medical treatment to encompass political consequences affecting territorial authority, Maribel warns, with emphasis on security that situation demands despite humanitarian necessity that makes assistance essential regardless of personal risk that involvement encompasses. The agreement that emerges creates partnership whose scope encompasses both medical emergency and political conspiracy through cooperation that serves individual welfare while challenging authority structure that separation was designed to maintain, making success dependent on secrecy alongside clinical competence, whose combination determines outcome affecting multiple levels of oceanic society. The journey to deep reef territories encompasses navigation through waters where territorial authority operates according to ancient agreements that kingdom diplomacy rarely addresses despite practical necessity for cooperation, when circumstances require resources that formal channels cannot provide through standard procurement methods that court bureaucracy would normally employ. Guardian entities require acknowledgement of respect rather than royal authority, Maribel explains, while approaching reef sections where powerful creatures maintain sovereignty that kingdom force cannot easily challenge despite territorial claims that formal law establishes through documentation, rather than practical ability to enforce compliance from beings whose cooperation serves mutual benefit. It over simple obedience. Diplomatic approach that honors autonomy while requesting assistance based on emergency necessity rather than political entitlement. She continues with strategy that encompasses both cultural sensitivity and practical necessity for obtaining cooperation from entities whose help operates through choice, rather than obligation that authority might attempt to impose. The negotiation that follows reveals complexity of oceanic diplomacy that extends beyond formal kingdom boundaries to encompass relationships with powerful entities whose cooperation serves emergency purposes while maintaining territorial independence, that formal authority acknowledges through practice despite theoretical claims that might suggest broader sovereignty. Medical emergency that threatens innocent life transcends political boundaries. Mermaid argues with appeal that encompasses both humanitarian principle and practical wisdom about territorial relationships, whose stability depends on mutual respect, rather than one-sided authority that could destabilize cooperation, essential for oceanic ecosystem balance. Counterpoison ingredients granted for humanitarian purpose, with understanding that such assistance serves broader oceanic welfare through preservation of life that political conflict should not eliminate. The Guardian responds with decision that acknowledges both emergency necessity and broader principles that govern territorial cooperation, despite formal political divisions. The successful procurement that provides essential materials creates foundation for treatment, whose implementation requires not just medical skill, but sustained care that encompasses extended healing process, rather than simple intervention, whose effects operate according to biological timeline that cannot be accelerated, despite urgency that political circumstances create. Treatment requires protected environment where healing can proceed without interference, Mermaid explains, while preparing intervention, whose success depends on both chemical precision and environmental stability, that stress could compromise despite medical accuracy that addresses immediate toxin effects. Royal pursuers will eventually locate Prince Nereon despite efforts at concealment, the Seahorse warns with recognition that time limitations affect treatment success through discovery that would interrupt healing process, whose completion determines whether intervention preserves or fails to save threatened lives. As evening approaches and treatment begins with careful administration of countertoxin whose effects require monitoring through extended observation, the reef sanctuary that has provided solitary refuge transforms into medical facility, whose significance encompasses both individual welfare and political consequences that extend far beyond immediate crisis to affect kingdom stability through CUCC. Eshun arrangements that birth will either establish or eliminate. The night that follows countertoxin administration encompasses careful monitoring that reveals both promising initial response and concerning developments, requiring immediate adjustment to treatment protocol, whose complexity extends beyond simple antidote application to encompass comprehensive medical management, that emergency circumstances complicate through resource limitations that exile has imposed. Fetal movement indicates positive response to toxin neutralization, while carrier shows signs of systemic stress that prolonged pregnancy has created through biological burden that male seahorse anatomy manages with difficulty under normal circumstances. Mermaid observes during examination that encompasses both encouraging progress and concerning complications requiring sustained intervention. Pain increases despite toxin elimination, Prince Nereon admits with clinical honesty that encompasses both physical discomfort and recognition, that birth process approaches despite body's resistance to delivery, that poisoning was designed to prevent through biological interference, that counter-treatment must now overcome without creating additional complications. Normal birth mechanisms require restoration through supporting therapy that addresses not just toxin effects, but underlying damage that prolonged interference has created. Mermaid explains with assessment that encompasses both immediate medical necessity and longer-term recovery requirements, whose scope extends beyond emergency intervention to encompass comprehensive healing. The treatment that develops encompasses both chemical intervention and therapeutic techniques that address biological stress, while supporting natural processes, whose restoration requires patient application rather than urgent correction, that could destabilize delicate balance between fetal welfare and carrier survival that successful birth demands. Healing arts that formal medical training overlooks through focus on dramatic intervention, rather than subtle support that natural processes require, she continues with explanation that encompasses both practical knowledge gained through exile experience and theoretical understanding that court education provided, despite political rather than purely medical focus. Such knowledge serves circumstances that court physicians cannot address through conventional methods. Prince Nereon observes with recognition that specialized expertise provides essential assistance, whose availability through chance encounter represents fortune that formal medical resources could not duplicate despite superior equipment and official authority. Exile education that encompasses both practical necessity and theoretical development through circumstances that formal position never provided. Mermaid responds with acknowledgement that isolation has created learning opportunities despite social disadvantages that banishment imposed through separation from resources that privilege once offered. But it is approaching presence that transforms medical vigil into political crisis, requiring immediate decisions about concealment, confrontation, or cooperation when discovery becomes inevitable, despite efforts at maintaining secrecy that circumstances make essential for protecting both patient welfare and provider safety from consequences that exposure could create. Royal investigation approaches through water disturbance that indicates organized search rather than casual patrol, Prince Nerion warns, with recognition that extended absence has triggered official response whose scope encompasses both family concern and political necessity for locating heir whose welfare affects kingdom stability through succession arrangements. Search patterns suggest comprehensive rather than random investigation through systematic exploration that indicates knowledge about general location, despite successful concealment of specific refuge. Mermaid adds with assessment that encompasses both immediate security threat and broader implications about information sources, whose accuracy creates vulnerability that careful preparation might address. Discovery becomes inevitable within current tide cycle, despite concealment efforts that have provided temporary protection. She continues with realistic assessment that acknowledges both security limitations and practical necessity for preparation that addresses confrontation, whose avoidance no longer remains possible through continued hiding. Confrontation with Sea King Thalassos requires strategic consideration that encompasses both medical necessity for continued treatment and political implications that unauthorized assistance creates through violation of exile restrictions. Prince Nerion states with recognition that approaching crisis encompasses both personal welfare and broader diplomatic consequences. The preparation that emerges encompasses both medical contingency planning and political strategy, whose scope addresses multiple scenarios that confrontation might encompass, depending on royal intentions that range from retrieval to punishment, through legal enforcement that exile technically permits despite humanitarian circumstances that intervention serves. Treatment continuation requires protected environment that confrontation might eliminate through forced relocation that interrupts healing process. Mermaid explains with emphasis on medical priorities, whose protection determines outcome regardless of political considerations that discovery creates through exposure of unauthorized assistance. Medical testimony that establishes emergency necessity for intervention might provide legal protection despite technical violation of exile restrictions, Prince Nerion suggests, with hope that humanitarian justification transcends legal formality when life preservation serves kingdom welfare through succession protection. Royal authority operates according to political calculation, rather than simple legal interpretation when circumstances affect kingdom stability. Mermaid responds with realistic assessment based on personal experience with monarchical decision-making that serves strategic necessity over individual justice when broader considerations demand flexibility. The approach that resolves into visible presence encompasses both expected authority and unexpected characteristics that suggest urgency, transcending normal royal protocol, through personal involvement that formal delegation would typically handle for matters affecting family welfare, rather than requiring direct monarchical attention. Sea King Thalassos arrives without formal escort. Prince Nerion observes with surprise that encompasses both relief about reduced confrontation scope and concern about circumstances that require personal, rather than official response to situation whose political implications should mandate careful diplomatic approach. Personal rather than official presence suggests emergency priority that transcends normal protocol, Mermaid acknowledges, with recognition that unusual royal behavior indicates crisis, whose scope encompasses more than simple air retrieval through circumstances requiring immediate rather than deliberate response. The figure that emerges from approaching current carries presence that encompasses both formal authority and personal desperation, whose combination creates atmosphere charged with tension that goes beyond simple political confrontation to encompass emotional territory where individual relationships intersect with official responsibility through circumstances that normal royal protocol cannot adder. Mermaid, Sea King Thalassos addresses with voice that carries both recognition and complex emotion, whose components encompass anger, relief, desperation, and something approaching gratitude, despite political circumstances that should maintain formal distance between exiled subject and royal authority, whose relationship operates through official rather than personal connection. Your Majesty, she responds with courtesy that acknowledges royal authority, while maintaining dignity appropriate to someone whose exile eliminates formal obligation, but whose humanitarian assistance serves kingdom welfare through emergency intervention, that circumstances rather than loyalty motivated. My heir's survival depends on assistance that formal medical resources cannot provide, he states with admission that encompasses both political vulnerability and personal desperation, whose acknowledgement represents unprecedented royal candor about limitations that authority typically conceals through appearance of omnipotent capability. Prince Nerion receives medical attention that emergency circumstances require despite technical violation of exile restrictions, Maribel replies, with clinical focus that emphasizes humanitarian priorities, while acknowledging legal complications that assistance creates through unauthorized intervention in royal family affairs. Exile restrictions become irrelevant when kingdom survival requires expertise that political separation eliminated through banishment, that circumstances prove counterproductive to collective welfare. Thalassos responds with pragmatic assessment that encompasses both political flexibility and recognition, that rigid adherence to punishment serves no beneficial purpose when crisis demands practico. Solution. The exchange that establishes emergency cooperation creates foundation for continued treatment, while addressing political complications through royal acknowledgement that circumstances transcend normal protocol, when kingdom welfare requires resources that formal structure cannot provide despite theoretical authority that should encompass all necessary capabilities. Treatment requires sustained intervention that successful birth demands, despite political complications that discovery creates, Maribel explains with emphasis on medical priorities, whose protection determines outcome regardless of diplomatic considerations that might complicate continued assistance. Political complications become secondary consideration when heir survival affects kingdom stability through succession arrangements that formal authority cannot preserve without medical expertise that exile eliminated. Thalassos acknowledges, with recognition that practical necessity supersedes political convenience when circumstances demand cooperation. Cooperation that serves kingdom welfare while addressing individual medical emergency, Prince Nerion adds, with relief that encompasses both personal safety and political resolution, whose achievement requires sustained collaboration rather than simple immediate intervention. As royal presence transforms hidden medical emergency into acknowledged crisis, requiring official rather than clandestine assistance, the reef sanctuary that provided exile refuge becomes medical facility, whose significance encompasses both individual welfare and kingdom stability through treatment, whose success determines not just personal survival, but broader political continuity. The night that continues encompasses both medical vigilance and political negotiation, whose scope addresses both immediate emergency and longer-term implications that successful intervention creates through demonstration, that exile punishment eliminated essential resources, whose restoration serves collective welfare rather than simple individual mercy. The dawn that follows royal arrival brings complications that extend beyond simple medical emergency to encompass comprehensive crisis, whose resolution requires not just successful treatment, but fundamental reassessment of political decisions, whose consequences affect both individual welfare and kingdom administration through exile policies that eliminate essential expertise during emergency circi. Stances requiring specialized knowledge. The birth process that begins with first light encompasses both natural progression that countertoxin has enabled and artificial complications that prolonged interference created through biological stress, requiring careful management, that formal medical training provides insufficient preparation for addressing despite theoretical knowledge about normal delivery procedures. Contractions indicate natural birth process resumption, while systemic weakness suggests carrier exhaustion that extended pregnancy has created through physical burden exceeding normal tolerance. Maribel observes during examination that encompasses both encouraging progress and concerning developments, requiring immediate intervention to prevent complications that could threaten both carrier and offspring survival. Pain management becomes essential for preventing shock that physical stress could trigger. she explains, while preparing supportive therapy, whose application requires not just medical knowledge, but intuitive understanding of seahorse physiology, whose complexity extends beyond standard veterinary education to encompass species-specific requirements. Breathing techniques that reduce stress while supporting natural birth mechanics. She instructs Prince Nerion with guidance that encompasses both practical assistance and emotional support, whose provision acknowledges psychological alongside physical aspects of birthing process, whose success depends on comprehensive rather than purely medical intervention. The labor that develops encompasses both normal progression and irregular complications that poisoning has created through biological interference, requiring constant adjustment to supporting treatment, whose effectiveness determines whether natural delivery achieves successful conclusion or requires emergency intervention that risks both lives through procedures whose outcome cannot be guaranteed. First offspring emerges successfully, Maribel announces with relief that encompasses both medical achievement and political significance, whose implications extend beyond individual survival to encompass succession arrangements that heir production establishes through demonstrated fertility, that kingdom stability requires for legitimate authority transfer. Healthy appearance despite prenatal stress. She continues with clinical assessment that encompasses both immediate vitality and longer-term development, whose monitoring will determine whether poisoning created lasting effects, that growth will reveal through delayed complications requiring sustained medical attention. Second offspring requires assistance. She observes with concern that encompasses both medical necessity and time pressure, whose constraints limit intervention options through biological timeline, that cannot accommodate extended procedures despite complexity, that complete birth process demands for successful conclusion. The emergency intervention that follows encompasses both standard assistance techniques and innovative approaches, whose necessity emerges from circumstances that formal medical training inadequately addresses through theoretical rather than practical preparation for complications that emergency situations create beyond normal birthing difficulties. Successful delivery completion. Maribel finally announces with exhaustion that encompasses both physical effort and emotional stress, whose relief acknowledges not just medical achievement, but political resolution, whose implications affect multiple lives through succession security, that heir production provides for kingdom stability. 5 healthy offspring despite deliberate interference, she continues with count, that encompasses both immediate success and broader significance, whose implications extend beyond medical achievement to encompass political victory against sabotage, that succession elimination was designed to accomplish through biological warfare. Royal bloodline preservation that serves kingdom continuity, Sea King Thalassos observes with relief, that encompasses both personal satisfaction about family welfare and political recognition about succession security, whose establishment eliminates vulnerability that heir absence created through constitutional crisis requiring immediate resolution. But it is post-delivery conversation that reveals personal motivations behind royal presence, whose urgency transcended normal protocol through circumstances that encompass both official necessity and individual emotion, whose acknowledgement requires honesty about relationship history, that political decisions affected through consequences extending beyond administrative efficiency. Exile punishment served political necessity that formal authority demanded despite personal recognition about individual worth, that circumstances required concealing through official rather than private assessment. Thalassos admits with candor that encompasses both political explanation and personal regret about decisions whose consequences affected both individual welfare and kingdom capability. Political marriage refusal represented threat to diplomatic arrangements whose failure created territorial vulnerability, requiring demonstration that royal authority maintained control, despite individual resistance to policies serving collective rather than personal welfare. He continues with context that encompasses both political justification and acknowledgement, that individual autonomy, deserre, ved consideration alongside strategic necessity. Personal preference about forced marriage should have received accommodation through alternative arrangements that served diplomatic necessity while honoring individual choice. He acknowledges with recognition that rigid enforcement created unnecessary conflict through inflexibility that circumstances prove counterproductive to achieving desired outcomes. Exile removal requires formal acknowledgement that punishment eliminated essential expertise whose restoration serves kingdom welfare, through recognition that individual contribution transcends political compliance when specialized knowledge benefits collective survival. Thalassos proposes, with offer that encompasses both personal mercy and practical necessity for restoring resources that banish. Meant, eliminated. Such acknowledgement encompasses both individual vindication and administrative reform that prevents similar expertise loss through political decisions whose consequences affect kingdom capability. Mermaid responds with recognition that personal restoration serves broader principles whose implementation benefits collective welfare through improved governance. Royal pardon that acknowledges both individual worth and systemic error. Prince Nerion adds with support that encompasses both personal gratitude and political wisdom, whose application honors humanitarian assistance while addressing administrative failures that created crisis requiring external rather than internal resources for resolution. The negotiation that develops encompasses both immediate pardon processing and longer-term constitutional reform, whose scope addresses exile policies that serve political control at expense of practical governance, when essential expertise requires retention rather than elimination through punishment that proves counterproductive to kingdom welfare. Medical expertise restoration that serves both individual recognition and kingdom capability through acknowledgement that specialized knowledge benefits collective welfare regardless of political compliance. Thalassos formalizes with decision that encompasses both personal mercy and practical necessity for maintaining resources essential to territorial sovereignty. Constitutional amendment that prevents essential expertise elimination through political punishment that serves control over capability when circumstances require practical rather than theoretical approach to governance. He continues with reform proposal that encompasses both individual protection and administrative wisdom, whose implementation prevents similar crises. Formal position restoration that acknowledges both individual contribution and systematic improvement. Mermaid accepts with recognition that personal vindication serves broader principles whose establishment benefits collective welfare through governance reform that honors both individual worth and practical necessity. The ceremony that formalizes pardon encompasses both personal restoration and political reform, whose significance extends beyond individual case to encompass constitutional precedent that protects essential expertise from political elimination when specialized knowledge serves kingdom welfare regardless of individual political compliance. As medical crisis resolves into political opportunity for governance reform, the reef sanctuary that provided exile refuge transforms into symbol of constitutional principle that individual worth transcends political convenience when circumstances demonstrate essential contribution to collective welfare through specialized knowledge that administrative wisdom should preserve rather than eliminate. The Seahorse family, whose survival required unauthorized assistance, becomes catalyst for recognition that rigid political enforcement creates vulnerability, that flexibility could prevent through governance that balances individual autonomy with collective necessity, rather than demanding absolute compliance that eliminates valuable resources. 6 months after emergency intervention transformed exile into restoration, the Royal Medical Academy that Mermaid now directs represents constitutional reform, whose practical implementation demonstrates how individual expertise serves collective welfare through institutional innovation that prevents essential knowledge elimination, despite political disagreements that might create temporary conflict. ICT between personal autonomy and administrative preference. The curriculum that encompasses both formal medical education and practical emergency response reflects lessons learned through crisis, whose resolution required expertise that conventional training inadequately addressed, creating comprehensive preparation for circumstances that theoretical knowledge alone cannot effectively manage through understanding that encompasses both clinical precision and de-intuitive adaptation. Emergency response protocols that encompass both standard procedures and innovative approaches when circumstances exceed normal training scope. She explains during lecture that addresses students whose education benefits from practical experience alongside theoretical foundation that crisis management requires for effective intervention during unprecedented situations. Medical ethics that honor both individual autonomy and collective welfare when emergency circumstances require rapid decision-making. She continues with emphasis on principles that guide treatment decisions, whose implications extend beyond immediate medical intervention to encompass broader questions about responsibility and authority during crisis situations. Prince Nerion's offspring development provides ongoing case study, whose monitoring reveals both successful recovery from prenatal stress and normal growth patterns that demonstrate effective intervention despite sabotage, whose sophisticated nature required equally sophisticated countertreatment through knowledge that exile experience, rather than formal training provided. Healthy development that encompasses both physical vitality and normal behavioral patterns. Royal pediatrician confirms during examination that acknowledges both medical success and broader implications about treatment effectiveness, whose validation supports expanded emergency response capability through institutional recognition. The constitutional amendment that protects essential expertise from political elimination establishes precedent whose significance extends beyond individual case to encompass broader governance principles that balance political authority with practical necessity for maintaining resources essential to kingdom welfare, regardless of temporary political disagreements. Legislative protection that prevents essential knowledge elimination through political punishment that serves control over capability. Constitutional scholar observes during analysis that acknowledges both individual protection and administrative wisdom whose implementation demonstrates governance evolution through practical experience. The marriage that Maribel and Prince Nerion celebrate represents both personal happiness and political symbolism, whose significance encompasses demonstration that individual choice can serve collective welfare when constitutional flexibility permits autonomous decision-making alongside diplomatic necessity, rather than demanding absolute compliance with political convenience. Partnership that honors both individual preference and family responsibility through arrangement that serves personal happiness alongside succession security. Sea King Thalassos acknowledges during ceremony that celebrates both family formation and constitutional principle, whose recognition demonstrates governance maturation. The medical research initiative that investigates biological warfare countermeasures represents institutional response to crisis, whose resolution revealed vulnerability that preparation could address through systematic, rather than reactive approach to threats that political competition might employ against succession stability. Research development that encompasses both defensive capability and broader medical advancement through investigation that serves both security necessity and general healthcare improvement. Research director announces during program establishment that acknowledges both immediate security concern and longer-term medical benefit. The territorial cooperation agreement that formalizes relationships with reef entities, whose assistance proved essential during emergency, demonstrates diplomatic innovation, whose scope encompasses resources that formal kingdom authority cannot effectively manage through conventional approaches that ignore environmental reality. Diplomatic recognition that acknowledges territorial autonomy while establishing cooperation frameworks for emergency circumstances. Foreign Relations Coordinator explains during treaty ratification that formalizes relationships whose practical necessity crisis circumstances revealed, despite previous informal acknowledgement. The educational exchange program that permits reef creature medical training creates unprecedented interspecies cooperation, whose scope encompasses both practical knowledge sharing and broader understanding that environmental health requires comprehensive rather than species-specific approach to medical intervention. Collaborative learning that encompasses both formal instruction and practical experience sharing. Academy Dean observes during program implementation, whose success demonstrates educational innovation through circumstances that conventional training inadequately addresses. The children whose birth triggered constitutional crisis now represent hope for kingdom future, whose stability encompasses both succession security and governance evolution that honors individual worth alongside collective responsibility through constitutional reform that prevents similar expertise elimination. Royal offspring whose survival catalyzed constitutional improvement that serves broader kingdom welfare. Succession historian notes during documentation that acknowledges both personal significance and broader implications for governance development through crisis resolution, because desperate plea for assistance evolved into constitutional reform that serves both individual vindication and collective benefit, demonstrating that humanitarian intervention can catalyze political evolution when circumstances reveal governance inadequacies that flexibility rather than rigidity can address through recognition that essential expertise transcends political convenience to serve. Kingdom welfare through institutional wisdom that accommodates both individual autonomy and collective necessity. The seahorse, whose pregnancy nearly ended in tragedy through political sabotage, has become symbol of constitutional principle that protects vulnerable populations from political interference, while the mermaid, whose exile nearly eliminated essential expertise, represents governance lesson that flexibility serves stability more effectively than rigid enforcement when circumstances require practical, rather than theoretical responses to crisis management. If you enjoyed this story, a like or comment really helps. And if you wish to hear more tales like this one, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next tale.